All right, it's great to have Mickey Bergman back on the podcast. Last time we spoke, Mickey, I was like, we need to have you back. And then a lot has unfolded here in the past few weeks. Most prominently, you were the first person I emailed when I saw the headline that a major prisoner exchange had succeeded, 7 countries, 24 people. And what's notable is when we spoke last month, you were saying, well, I don't know if a deal is likely before the election. The deal that Putin wants is not pretty, was the word that you used. Yeah. What changed?
Well, first of all, yes, when we talked last month, we talked about how we know what Putin wants. And yes, it never is pretty. But we also knew that Putin didn't want to do anything that would make President Biden look good in an election year. Now, a couple of things changed since we last spoke. First, President Biden is not running for re-election. And second, there is much less clarity now in the analysis of who might actually win in November. And I think both of these factors have changed calculations both in Washington and in Moscow as to the urgency and accelerated the negotiations. From a Washington side, President Biden not hinged or not constrained by the need to run a campaign, seems to be very, very determined to clear some of these cases, to bring some of these Americans home before he leaves the White House. And that allowed him to probably agree to things that he otherwise would have a harder time agreeing if he's running for re-election. And from Putin's perspective, it's not just that Biden is not the nominee, because Kamala Harris for Putin is the same from that perspective, but the prospects that it might not be Donald Trump come January 20th. Maybe Putin has decided, you know what, let me just get what I can get now, because Biden really wants to do it, so I can squeeze whatever I can. And not count on what happens in November.
So the way you explain it, though, is that, ultimately Putin favors a Trump presidency. Is there an actual fear? Because this is what Trump has been saying. I would have made a much more difficult deal for Putin. I wouldn't have returned anything to Vladimir Putin to bring home these Americans. What do you make of what Trump's been saying and Putin's calculation here?
Yeah, first of all, I take everything that Trump is saying now, it's campaign rhetoric. We have to take it with a grain of salt. Because the truth is, when Trump was president, he did deals. I worked on them with his administration.
Right, there were deals with Iran, with the Houthis, with Afghanistan. There were deals actually entailed the U.S. freeing prisoners. Yes,
absolutely, and yes, so it's and that's actually something that we need to be all proud of as Americans. That no matter who sits in the White House, the president actually does work to bring back Americans. Now, there's obstacles, there are different calculations, different motivations, but we do that. So I chalk the Trump sentences mainly into campaign language and rhetoric. It is not true, in my assessment, that Putin feared that if Trump gets into power, the negotiations will be harder in terms of the hostages, because Putin actually was holding back on doing this deal because he was looking for a Trump presidency. So that's a little counter to Trump's and Vance's rhetoric on this. But regardless, it's one of those things that we will not know because the deal happened now. But I am glad that it happened, and I do think that it was an extremely complicated. I have to say something to clarify. Moshe, as you know, I've worked with a lot of these families and with some of the families of the Americans who are still behind for years. And I continue to work with those who are left behind. But this deal was negotiated and executed by the U.S. government. It caught me while I was with the Russians last week in a pre-scheduled meeting about some of these creative ways of resolving some of the lesser cases. It is still relevant because they're still remain there. I'm working on 4 other cases of Americans who have been left behind on this. And it was a pretty surreal experience to be with the Russians, to talk to them, both of us knowing that the deal is undergoing as we're sitting and talking, but neither of us really knowing all the details of it, because at the end of the day, it was getting executed by the intelligence apparatus of both countries.
Yeah, let's back up here. Explain, Mickey, your role, who you're dealing with, how the U.S. government communicates, the various levels here, and specifically when it comes to this major exchange, what role people like you had in this?
Yeah, so that's the point of clarification, that in this specific one, this was a U.S. government operation. We've been working on it for so long, and we've been in the middle, and I was actually, again, with the Russians talking while this was happening with my counterparts. We knew when it was happening more or less what it looks like. We all knew that in order for the United States to get Paul Whelan and Evan Gershowitz back, Vadim Kozikov had to be returned.
Vadim Kozikov is the assassin who Germany had. He murdered a Chechen in the middle of Berlin. Correct. And the Germans had him in prison for life.
Yeah, and I think you and I talked about it last month when we said that, there are two cardinal truths about this kind of work that I've learned over 18 months of doing. The first one is the fact that deals never get better with time. And in the past, this same assassin who was held in Germany was a no-starter. And the Russians knew that. But over time, it became a reality. Just like Victor Bout early in my negotiations was a non-starter and then ended up being released for Brittany Griner. Those deals never get better. And there's a part of me that says, oh, why did we wait so long? We could have done it for cheaper before. But then there's another part, Mosh, that says, I'm glad we did it now, because had we waited, it would have been even worse.
But again, your role here as an independent operator that works on behalf of the families, Mickey, how are you communicating? What role do you play with the families, with the U.S. government, with governments like the Russians?
Yeah, so in this, it's important to understand we are a non-government organization. We work on behalf of the families at their request, at no cost to them. So our obligation is to the families that we work with. And our ability to resolve cases is typically in two kind of ways. The first one, and it's much more rare, is when we figure out a scheme of how we're actually able to get somebody home without the involvement of the U.S. government, or without the U.S. government giving anything in return. And we did that with Russia too, with Taylor Dudley. In January of 2023, we were able to get him out after 9 months of captivity over there. Taylor Dudley is a former U.S. Navy guy who was in Kaliningrad, which is a little extraterritorial area of Russia near Poland. But in most cases, especially with the Russians, our ability is to talk to our Russian counterparts, who, just like ours, are non-government, but have the connections directly to the Kremlin and to the leadership, and they are aware that we have these contacts, and we are able to talk and throw in ideas and creatively thinking in installation about the prisoners and the pathway of how somebody comes home. That's where we experiment with different ideas, like the mutual repatriation of nationals, which would be really the cleanup of all Americans that are being held in Russia and Russians that are held in the United States. Not only spies or accused spies, but actual also petty criminals that can serve the rest of their terms, but just in their country, because this is such a problematic issue for us. And things like that, or things like specific methods like we did with Trevor Reed or Brittany Griner before, that we're able to refine and define with our Russian counterparts, and then bring it to our government to see if they would do it.
Again, so there's parallel tracks happening here. There's parallel conversations happening.
Oh, there are more than, there's multi-layer, because, we're doing it on behalf of the families. We have the official channel of the Americans and the Russians talking, and even that is happening at the level of National Security Council. It's happening at the level of the CIA. It's happening at the level of the State Department. And then more than that, there are foreign governments who want to help. And with Russia, we had, I know that a big chunk of the exchange took place in Turkey physically, but it's not that the Turks participated necessarily in the substance of it. But I can tell you.
By the way, the Turks are playing up their role significantly.
Well, of course, and everybody takes credit, and that's fine. And from my perspective, that's very good. And I'll tell you who I give credit on this one again in a second. But I do know, for example, that the Qataris were involved in these conversations in trying to help. The Saudis were involved in these conversations trying to help.
In this conversation?
In this specific negotiation. Now, to the extent that they were helpful or not helpful, that remains within the constraints of the US government and the knowledge of how it actually played out. But we're talking here about prisoners from multiple countries and all the channels and zero trust. Belarus, Russia, Germany, Slovenia, US, like it's a mess to put it together. And that's why I actually give tons of credit, because the coordination of this had to happen at the US government level, CIA, National Security Council, and State Department actually working together with all the different pieces for that. And I say that because I've been doing this for 18 years. It is rare to see such a complex deal come together so well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned extra countries that didn't have prisoners involved here, but officially 7 countries. And also we'll add in Norway, we'll add in Poland, 7 countries, 26 people, including the 2 children of the 2 Russians who were being held in Slovenia. Who I want to talk about them in a second. And it doesn't look like every country that gave someone up got something in return. And so I'm wondering, the Norways, the Polands of the world, et cetera, how does that work? What's their incentive reward here for giving Putin somebody?
Yeah, that part is something that we don't really necessarily know, and we probably will not know. But that's the value of actually having friends and relationships that go beyond national interests. It goes into the core of what I talk about, what I write about, and what I do. If our relationship with Norway was just based on common national interests, then if you need a favor from them because you really need that deal to happen and you need them to do something for you, they'll ask you, what do I get in return? But if the relationship is based on much deeper level, it's a personal level, it's emotional level between individuals who are currently in certain positions, and we're able to say, look, it's complicated as it is. We can't have you get something in return for this, but we need you to do this for us. And they will do that as allies and as friends. And that's the difference between a pure national interest objective and approach into much more of a human approach and a relationship approach. Same goes with Poland. Now, of course, there's certain things that these countries, and I don't know of anything tangible that they received from it, but even the non-tangible of knowing that they just helped the United States do something that the president of the United States really wanted to do, they'll call on it at some point.
Right. Yeah. For example, the reporting came out that the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, told Biden, "For you, I'll do this."
Yeah, and these are the type of things that that actually, it sounds all we're talking at the high level of it, but just a sentiment like that from the German Chancellor to Biden is a difference between the life and death of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershowitz. It ends up in human lives.
Tell me, you mentioned Vadim Kozikov. He's the assassin who Putin desperately wanted back. Why so important for Putin?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, the common assumption is, look, he is, Putin himself is a KGB, FSB guy. There's a camaraderie there. You don't leave people behind. You work on it. You figure out. For him, there's probably a personal loyalty or institutional loyalty there. The fact that he actually went to see him. Well, I guess both presidents did a reception of their incoming prisoners. But beyond that, I think that there is a win for Putin on this. Russia does see political prisoners as a legitimate tool in statecraft. And he just proved that it is, because he got what he needed out of it. But he got it not only from the United States. It's not like Victor Bout for Brittany Griner, because he really wanted Victor Bout. He got the US to influence Germany to get him his guy. It's not like he was holding German citizens that he needed to give back. But there is this, there's...
But though, what about all the people who are going to Germany? There's like a number of them, right?
Yeah, but it's not, again, the advantage of and we talked about it before, the advantage of doing such a big deal is politically, the viability of it is that you really don't you don't need to justify who you got for who. It's much more amorphous. It's like this group, and right now we don't tell. We can tell like the guys who went back to Germany did not go back to Germany in return for Vadim, because they're not at the same level. It's clear that Paul Whelan was the need for Vadim to be released. But that's kind of, again, it's a political tool. One of the things, Moshe, that is important for me, because as we're celebrating all of this, the last 3 days now, I've been spending with the families of those Americans who are left behind.
Yeah, let's talk about them. There's Mark Fogel, the teacher. There's Andrei Khachaturian. There's Ksenia Karolina. As we talk about the people who were freed, a number of Americans left behind, and was wondering about the calculation there in terms of. And you had mentioned the last time we spoke, Paul Whelan had been left behind 4 times before this. Who do you prioritize? How does that prioritization work?
So, look, we work on behalf of certain families that reach out to us. And I have, I'm working on Andrei Khachaturian, who is a man from California, 3rd generation in his family's plumbing business, who was arrested in December before the war started, sentenced to 8 years. The accusation was of arms trafficking, but the story behind it is that he went to visit his fiancée in Yerevan, Armenia. Before the war, the flights always went through Moscow. He has a licensed gun, which he checked according to to all of the processes in his checked luggage, not in his carry-on, had TSA approval, had the airline approval, all that stuff. And in transit, he wasn't feeling well physically, so they pulled out his luggage to get access to his medicine. At that point, hypothetically, he had access to the gun, therefore violated Russian law. Okay, 8 years in jail for that. A Russian that would have done the same thing would have gotten a fine and be released. And it wasn't something of his intention. It was a circumstance that took place there. Robert Gilman, a former American Marine, who was in Russia visiting, and his visa expired during COVID. His visa expired by 1 day, and he was detained. Now, that was not a breaking of the law in Russia, because during COVID there was an automatic renewal. So he was released from prison the next day, only to be rearrested because suddenly the officer that arrested him claims that he kicked him. He was put on trial and was given 4.5 years. And since then, he's been racking more charges in prison, the Russians accusing him that he keeps punching security guards. But we have videos. They are provoking him for that. They are touching him inappropriately and provoking instinctual stuff. And then he's sitting for another trial to extend, for new charges because of it. David Barnes, who's an American man who was married to a Russian woman with 2 children. And when their marriage was falling apart and they were working on divorce, she asked for full custody. She didn't get it here in Texas. She didn't get it. She claimed that he molested the children. The U.S. authorities investigated it twice, concluded that she's making it up because she wants custody of the kids. And then she kidnapped the kids and ran to Russia. And David, as a father, hired a Russian lawyer, tried to figure out legally how can he go to Russia, be there, and apply for visitation with his kids, only to be arrested in Russia before he ever saw his kids by her for the same claims that she made here, and he was given 20 years in prison. And he's there. But that is a parental, fight over there. And Ksenia Karolina, who you mentioned, a ballerina, former Russian, immigrated to the United States, married an American, divorced since, but is an American citizen, worked in a spa in Los Angeles, went to visit her grandparents who are sick in Russia, and was arrested because on her phone they found out that she gave $50 to a Ukrainian charity. And she is on trial that is scheduled to start in 3 days on August 7th for treason.
So all these people you mentioned, still there. How does the calculation, in this major 26-person, 7-country swap, how do they determine we got to get this one and this one, but these guys Sorry.
It's not the right way to say that it's the $1 million question, because it's much more valuable than that. It is a really, really difficult question, Moshe. I wish I knew the calculation inside the US government. I can tell you more or less the lines are those who have been designated by the United States government as wrongfully detained.
That's an important designation the State Department makes.
Yes. Now, the State Department and the US government has been trying to argue with families of those who have not been designated over the last several years to say, hey, just because somebody is not designated doesn't mean that we're not trying to get him home. Well, they just proved the opposite, because everybody that I just mentioned to you has not been designated yet.
What's the reason behind the U.S. not designating everyone wrongfully detained?
The law is, the law that the designation is based on is called the Levenson Act. It was passed in December. It was signed into law in December 2020. So that was one of Donald Trump's last acts in office. It's a very good law in its intention. It establishes 11 criteria of how the U.S. government evaluates a detention to figure out if it's wrongful or not wrongful. Mm-hmm. However, there is a line at the bottom of these 11 criteria that it says that the U.S. government will make the determination based on the totality of circumstances. That is Washington speak to, yes, we have these criteria, but it's really a black box and it's up to us. And the intention of the law was to actually force or to create clarity between cases. The unintentional consequences was that anybody that did not cross the threshold, nobody's advocating for their release. And this is evidence of this situation. Now, if you can, as you can imagine, the categories are pretty clear. There are things about due process, whether an American, who, even if the American violated the local law, whether the punishment is equivalent to what a national will get for this, or are they treating Americans differently? Different things like that. Access to consular services, a lot of criteria like that. But because it's under the totality of circumstances, you can have policy arguments internally that they're not transparent with, that say, hey, we really can't afford another problem, or the list is too long and we won't be able to do it. Let's not determine right now. And by the way, the US government doesn't say no. They just say, we haven't determined yet. Mm-hmm. But right now you have a bunch of families who've been told, don't worry about the determination on this one. Just let's focus on the well-being and let's focus on bringing people home. And now they're saying, wait a minute, you just left us behind. Now everybody's going to sue the government for this. I mean, Mark Fogel's family already and James Wilge's family already sued the U.S. government, the State Department, for transparency over the designation process, because both of them have not been designated. It might force the government to reveal information that is not publicly known about them, about their cases. But that is a dynamic that is not going to be very useful, because for me, again, right now, so the deal is the deal. If it was, I know it's easy for me to say because I don't know how sensitive it was inside the negotiations, but it appears as if we paid the big price already. It probably would not have been that much more difficult to include a few more petty criminals, Russians, who are held here, in return for what the Russians will claim are petty criminal Americans held over there, and just get everybody done. But I'm speaking out of line, because it is possible that any additional complexity added to this deal would have crushed it. And then the right decision was to bring the people you can bring back home when you can bring them home. But it is what it is. Right now, my claim is, without arguing for wrongful detention or not wrongful detention, we still have the ability, especially now that the pressure is down between the two sides, there's a moment of collaboration over this, of success, of making deals to bring the rest of them home, another exchange if needed. I'm personally working on a couple of those, and I hope that they work. But that's, we can't rejoice and say, okay, we're doing well here because we just brought a big chunk of what is the most famous cases back. Because as I told you before, over time, the new deals will only get worse.
Yeah, we're talking, I think the Foley Foundation says it's about 50. What's your calculation in terms of the number of Americans wrongfully detained?
I think Foley Foundation right now is saying 46 additional.
Okay.
But again, it's, if you ask Jory Reid, Trevor Reid's father, who's been involved in this since his son was in Russia and has not stopped advocating even after his son came back, he tells me that in his calculation he has many more who are wrongfully detained, and he's really upset that the U.S. government often takes the narrative of the captors and assume the guilt of Americans.
One criticism, among the criticism that you've heard, we talked about Trump's, saying, we gave Putin too much, and I would have given him a much more challenging deal. You also had other Republicans. You had Michael McCaul, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who celebrated, bringing the Americans home, but said that he remains concerned that trading innocent Americans for actual Russian criminals only encourages more hostage taking by Putin here. That, as you explained to me on the podcast last time, after the Brittany Griner thing, because he didn't get his assassin, he knew he had to pick up a couple more people to bring him home. So ultimately, what's the incentive structure here for Putin? What has he learned from the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge something very important, because that argument, and we talked about it last time, I'm happy to repeat it again, just because to make sure somebody who hasn't listened to our last conversation, because it's such an important thing, that criticism, it resonates so much with all of us because it's emotional, it's logical. Oh my God, we're doing these deals. We're legitimizing the deals. We're legitimizing the
Oh, read the comments when I post about it on Instagram. The hundreds and hundreds of people who all echo that. Yeah,
I know. And again, two things about this that are so important. The first one, all the research that exists out there, all the data that is out there, shows that there's absolute no correlation whatsoever between the way these cases are resolved, deals or no deals, with the number of Americans that are taken after. And actually, we are in a moment now that we look at, after the deals with Venezuela in December. So we are, 8 months since the deal that we cleaned up everybody in Venezuela's left. We still don't have new Americans being taken. So, that just a data point on this. And I argue also the opposite of it, as I did before, like, they picked up Paul Whelan because they wanted Marina Butina, the Russian spy that was then caught. Then we only gave her a very, very minimal charge. So they said, the Russians said, we're not going to waste Paul Whelan on her. She can serve her 18 months and then she'll come home, which she did. But they wanted somebody in return. They wanted Konstantin Yaroshenko. The U.S. did not negotiate. So they took Trevor Reid. The U.S. did not negotiate, so they took Brittany Griner. Suddenly, the U.S. was negotiating, and we got Reid and we got Griner back.
Right, you're making Congressman McCall's argument right now.
Well, no, I'm not, because I'm actually doing exactly the opposite. I'm arguing that the fact that we did not negotiate was the reason why they kept taking more Americans.
The price became steeper.
Yeah, and so and once we negotiated with Brittany Griner, but we left Paul Whelan back there, they still had we stopped negotiating after that, and so they started picking more. They started picking Evan. So my argument is the opposite. Is saying, according to data that shows that actually when you refuse to negotiate, it incentivizes them to pick more Americans to force you to negotiate. That was the same thing with the Venezuelans, by the way. They had Citgo 6. They had somebody they wanted. We didn't negotiate with them for a while. They started picking more Americans. Eventually, we had more than 20 Americans in Venezuela by the time it's all over. And since then, we don't have anybody. So again, I'm not claiming that negotiating is the way to mitigate this. It's not. I'm just saying there is just no correlation between how you resolve it and the cases that come after. But here's the most important part of it for me: the ethical and the moral part of it. If we claim, as McCall is not saying, but he's suggesting, McCall is a good guy and he wants to bring Americans home. But the way he's suggesting, saying we need to refuse to negotiate because that's how we build deterrence. That means, and this is a hard thing that I'm saying now, that means that we are using our innocent hostages as hostages to our policy agenda. We're using them in order to create deterrence. I believe we're stronger than that. I believe that we bring them home and then we figure out how to deter and how to mitigate that. And that is something I will go and I will fight for that. And I do that. I do that constantly when I talk, because that is the ethical, the moral. That's like we need to know as Americans. These are, these Americans. They did nothing. The only thing that they did wrong is that they're American citizens. It's our responsibility to bring them home, and we are strong enough to figure out how to deter and how to inflict pain on the other side once our people are back home.
Media question for you. A lot of attention was put on Bloomberg News going early with the story.
Yeah.
And I saw there was a report, Fox News sort of reported early and then deleted it from their website. They broke a media embargo. The government briefed the media saying, this is what's about to happen. Nobody can go with it. Yeah. We'll tell you when. Bloomberg News went with it while Evan was still in Russian custody. How risky was that? How much could that have put the deal at risk, the fact that that came out?
You cannot overestimate how risky and dangerous that is. It is not the first time that it's happening. Look, the Venezuela deal almost blew up on the tarmac in an island because an organization went out publicly with it before time. Now, the way the journalists do it, they're getting typically an off-the-record or an embargoed briefing by the NSC. And they're getting the details, but it's embargoed. Then they start calling other contacts, experts, people like me, people, people who claim to know.
Right, to prepare their stories.
And then they're saying, well, we're hearing that is this happening. And anybody that wants to show as if they're in the know will confirm something. And then they have a confirmation outside of the US government source, so they go for it. It's extremely irresponsible, by the way. I have to tell you, even though I knew it was happening, I was abroad meeting with Russians at the time, and families were reaching out to me. I could not answer them. I did not even say, I kept their messages unread, so they know that I haven't read it. And after the fact, I told them, look, it was not my operation. I couldn't say a word because any word that I would say, anything I would respond to you might risk it. And it's, the need to bring out the news first, unfortunately supersedes the need to actually be responsible and bring the right news. And more than that, just to be responsible people. Now, I found with journalists in the past that have had the story and had it confirmed in different places, they could have gone out. It wasn't breaking anything professionally. They would have been okay with it. But when you have that relationship with the journalist, say, hey, look, I know you know that. I'm asking you as a person, we all want this to work. Hold on that story. Sometimes they will ask the government then for an exclusive or something in addition.
Oh, I've been part of those talks, Mickey, at CBS News, where we've gotten a callback from the Pentagon or the White House. And they're like, listen, you have the story, but please don't run it because it's going to put a lot of things in jeopardy for us.
Yeah, and most people are responsible. Most journalists almost all of them, they always sit on the story because they don't want to be the ones risking something like that. And it is so risky because like anything that gets said in an article like that, you don't know what will be the word that will trip somebody off. And with so many actors so sensitive to this, one tripping on a wire can completely cascade and leave people, and the whole thing can fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, especially in an operation as complex as this. I mentioned the couple from Slovenia, and I am intrigued about it partially because I was a big fan of the show The Americans.
Yeah,
about deep undercover.
It sounds like it was straight from the
right.
script.
This is a Russian couple. They pretend to be from Argentina. They live in Slovenia. They set up independent jobs. They have kids. The kids thought they're from Argentina. They speak to the kids in Spanish. They're arrested. The kids find out on the flight back to Moscow this week that they're actually Russian. They're greeted by Putin, who apparently said "Buenos noches" to them. Is this also? Did you know much about? Has this couple been mentioned as part of previous exchanges?
To be honest, I don't. It's funny when we, typically the shows they like the TV shows, they like to rip from the headlines, right? Well, now we need to do that on reality. Ripped from the TV shows.
Exactly.
Look, but those TV shows are typically based with consultants who have done this. And so they have the good shows, at least, that know a sense of reality into it. It's a funny world out there when it comes to those things. But it's, it exists. It's there. There's intelligence. There's counterintelligence operations. You don't we find ourselves wondering several times in my line of work, and I can't get into the details of it, of whether a case that you're dealing with is just too good to be true. Thinking that, is it a counterintelligence operation? There's just a lot of that happening in this. But again, I've never been a part of intelligence services, so I can't speak to that. Even if I was, I would not be able to speak to that.
Yeah, there's an understanding too that you have these deep undercover, but then officially, I've had friends who work for the U.S. government in intelligence, and they go to a country officially as part of the State Department, and there's sort of this understanding that foreign embassies, a number of the employees there aren't actually there as diplomats; they're there as intelligence agents.
Yeah, there's the attachés, and that makes sense. And then there's and there's a whole other thing. Look, there's in our world, there's the people who are actual agent and deep agents that do this. And this is a case, it sounds like it's a case of people were they a couple as they were, or were they forced to be a couple as a part of their job? Who knows how those things work? Then there's the other level of espionage that is out there, which is people who are actually not knowingly being agents. They have developed relationships, they benefit from them to some extent, but they're not knowingly. They don't think that they're giving information to. They
don't realize who the end recipient is.
And they're not doing it. They don't believe that they're betraying anything. It's a very weird, and it's not only our the foreign governments that do that. We do the same.
Oh yes, it's for us to ever be shocked that something's happening in our country. We've probably done it in several others. I want to shift to the Middle East. Yes. The Hamas deal. The ongoing talks, we've been talking for months about this. There's increasing criticism as we speak now of the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, that he's not taking it seriously, that he isn't taking the deal. This comes from high-level officials in his own government, military officials, national security officials.
At this point, I think it comes from high-level officials in Israel, both on the security side and the political side, his own government. It comes out of from the defense minister. It comes from the Mossad. It's coming from everybody. Yeah, and over the last 24 hours, it appears to have been coming also from the White House that they realized that. And I can tell you, some of the families of hostages who met with Bibi Netanyahu while he was here in Washington came out of those meetings saying they couldn't believe how dismissive he was.
Right. I spoke to somebody who said that they found in the meeting that the Israeli families or American families who have hostages being held by Hamas, they found that Biden was sympathetic, open, wanting to make a deal, and that they felt a cold shoulder from Netanyahu.
Yeah. And they told me, some of the families told me of dismissive, hand gestures and all these things. And Biden would go and so how we comment and Bibi would just, what he said. Kind of thing, like that kind of thing. They came out of it, as the families that I spoke with came out of those meetings feeling as if Bibi Netanyahu has already assumed that the hostages are dead and he treats them as shaheeds. And that's how he's using it politically. Look, one of the things out of this Russia deal, and I've been saying it in media interviews as long as they let me say that, let Bibi take a lesson here from Biden. This is what leaders do. You do everything it takes to bring your people home, even if it stinks. And then you figure out, you're strong enough to figure out what to do with the consequences of it. But first you bring your people home.
People over politics.
Yeah. And I've been arguing for, where are we? So, August now. So more than 8 months now. That is exactly the calculation of Bibi Netanyahu. And that's the only thing that will make a deal. It's not because, look, to be clear, because before everybody will get mad at me online for saying this. Hamas is the reason why we have hostages. Hamas is the reason why we're at this war. Having said that, Bibi Netanyahu has the ability to bring his hostages back home, and he chooses not to do it. He's avoiding the hard decisions that Biden is willing to make.
And people will say that's a political calculation. Ultimately, what does he have to do? What does Israel have to give up at this point? What is their compromise that he has to make to get the hostages home?
Yeah, look, the deal that is on the table now, I know people like to spin a lot and talk about details to make drama around it. The deal that is on the table now, as you and I talked about last month, is exactly the same deal that existed in mid-December. The only difference is that we have less hostages alive, but it's the same deal. The linchpin on that deal, it's 3 stages. The linchpin of the deal is Israeli guarantees that the war will be over if we enter that deal. Bibi refuses to do that. He comes up with different scenarios and different solutions. I'm telling you, Hamas does not budge. It's not something positive about Hamas. It's just the way they do. I know it because that's how the negotiations happened with them in the past. They don't care.
They haven't changed their position in 8 months.
They haven't changed their positions in 8 months. Everything you're hearing about changing flexibility, it's that spins. They haven't changed their position. They don't care if the hostages die. They don't care if Palestinians die. They don't even care if they themselves die. They will prefer that over budging over this. Now, Bibi is a smart man. He knows Hamas well enough. He knows that to be the truth. So he keeps coming up with all of these different variations and do different suggestions, claims, we send a new suggestion, knowing that Hamas will refuse. But that's what the narrative that he wants. He wants to be able to say a narrative, I'm trying, but Hamas refuses. Now, it's true that Hamas refuses any changes, but it also is true that Bibi knows that they will continue to do that, and he chooses not to make that deal that is on the table. And Moshe, I would argue right now, again, I'll probably now get a lot of other groups angry with me with this. By now, Bibi could have done that deal, got the hostages home, and at this point could have even restarted the war, because none of us have any illusion believing that Hamas would not give an excuse for Israel to restart the war, violating whatever agreement there is.
Right. They would have sent a rocket at this point.
Yeah, they would have sent a rocket. And you know what? In this day and age, Israel could have actually sent a rocket, looks like it's Hamas, and start the war if they really wanted to. There's a lot of ways of doing this. It could have been done. We could have had the hostages back home, and you could still, do your assassinations if you think that that's the right thing to do. I personally think it's the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. Not that I have any warm feelings about the guy, not at all whatsoever.
Right, I wanted to ask about that. What do we think the impact of that is going to be?
First of all, again, he's not a good guy. He's a terrorist. But he was also at the same time not bad. At the same time, he was not a ticking bomb. He wasn't planning something that would risk Israelis at that point. So the choice to take him out was not a choice out of an operational necessity. It was a choice out of revenge and making a big symbol. Now, Haniyeh himself was not a decision maker at this point when it comes to Gaza. All the decisions are made by Yehia Sinwar in the tunnels under Rafah. Okay, Haniyeh is not even the conduit. Haniyeh doesn't go and talk to Sinwar. It's the mediators that go in, the Egyptians and the Qataris that go into the tunnels and figure out how to communicate with him. So on the substance, Haniyeh was irrelevant to the negotiations and to the deal. That's on the substance. But symbolic and emotionally speaking, he absolutely is relevant. And he's, taking him out creates such an impact that it probably holds up, even if Bibi now says, hey, okay, I'm ready to do the deal, let's sign. Hamas will take them 10, 14 days until they'll be willing to respond to that after this kind of slap in the face. But Ismail Haniyeh's killing had nothing to do with Hamas, had everything to do with Iran.
Right, and now Iran is weighing its response to all of this. And what is that dynamic? Does the negotiations that Sinwar is doing, that Hamas's decision-making, how much of that hinges on Iran here?
Not much at all. Hamas,
they don't take their cues from Tehran.
No, I mean, I don't know even if they have much communication these days, because every communication is a risk for Sinwar. But Hamas, it's important. People forget Hamas is a proud, independent Palestinian program. They are assisted by the Iranians. They're assisted by the Turks. They were assisted financially by the Qataris and by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But they are independent. They don't take their cues from anybody else. They do their own thing. So it doesn't impact those negotiations. But again, the Iranian dynamic here is much more robust because the Iranians are, they have their arms and their influence on Hezbollah. They have their arms and influence on the Shiite militias in Iraq. They have their influences on the Houthis in Yemen. There is a whole bunch of regional threats that they're able to do beyond their direct abilities. Is it existentially threatening Israel? I don't think so. It's going to be really, really bad in terms of the violence if it really goes unleashed that way. But it's not existentially threatening the state of Israel. But there's a part of it that if it lights up regionally, the United States is not going to stand by. There's going to be a complete embrace and support in ammunition and military support to Israel. And
right, that's the bet. That's the bet that Netanyahu made ultimately. Is that despite the fact that he's getting yelled at on the phone by Biden and all these leaks are coming through, that his bet is that at the end of the day, it is, and the CENTCOM commander, the Central Command who handles the region, is in Israel, and the U.S. will stand by.
It is a way to eliminate daylight between Washington and Jerusalem. Unfortunately, it's going to come at the cost of human lives.
I wanted to end with Iran because this is a question I didn't get to last time we spoke, which is you're an Israeli. You live here in America. Iran does not recognize Israel. They declare death to Israel, death to America. You negotiate with them. We talked last time, you're talking to the foreign minister of Iran, et cetera. Tell me about that dynamic, how difficult that is, that their willingness to meet with you, et cetera. To those of us who are just observers, you're like, how can that be? How can Mickey Bergman be negotiating with Iranians?
Yeah, it sounds completely outrageous, right? It sounds like weird. Like I'm the worst person to do these negotiations.
I would be very nervous if I were you. Based on they're going to grab me at some point.
I never go to Iran.
Got
it. That I don't do. I meet them either with the representatives here at the United Nations or in a third country. But the truth is, again, over the years, when you develop, that's the difference again between what looks like a paper relationship and a personal relationship. The relationships that you build, the individuals, the people. I know this sounds really, really weird, but even the Iranians and even the regime in Iran that I have, conflict with on so many levels. The individuals don't wake up in the morning saying, "Oh, we're evil. Let's see what evil we can do in the world today." There's a certain narrative and a certain way that they see the world and their role in it that makes them believe that what they're doing is really the right thing to do. And I'm not saying it in order to justify them or to absolve them of any responsibility for the terrible things that they're responsible for. I'm just saying that it's on the individual level, you can make a connection. You learn about their families. You get to know their families. They get to know yours. You share certain values. You find what it is in common, and you work with that. Sometimes it's easier when you have a click on personality and you're able to do it, but it's not faking it. It's not, I'm not going and I'm pretending to like somebody when I don't like them. I can't do that. I'm not, otherwise I would be an actor. I can't do that. I don't have a poker face. It is genuine, but we know the limitations of it as well. And I had some exchanges with some of the more conservative and hardcore parts of the Iranian regime that would tell me privately after October 7th, we lean in and say, Mickey, what they did at the music festival, that violence towards women, that's not Muslim. And you have moments like that I know it's like grasping at straws a little bit, but you have moments like that where it's like, we actually do have some level of common humanity.
Our country calls for the destruction of your country, but we still
And again, and it's, if I were a diplomat, trust me, I would have to stand up and walk away, after 10 minutes of a conversation from the things that I'm hearing. But I have an agenda. I want to get people home, and when I find that commonality, and I find that kind of relationship, we're able to chart a pathway. It's mutually beneficial. That's what I do. Now they know. You can't hide, except for not only that my accent tells in a second where I'm from, even though I've been here for 24 years, can't hide that. But you also can't hide this day and age who you are and your background. Yeah. And trust me, there's no diplomat around the world.
Well, and you've gone above and beyond, Mickey. You wrote a book about yourself.
Apparently, I'm no longer in the shadows. But even before, nobody, no diplomat will go into a meeting not Googling and then figure out who the person is. Googling is the least. It's probably much more of getting an intelligence report on somebody. But they also find in it who I am and who I am not. And that helps a lot. And sometimes when those relationships and those conversations become public, they get burnt as well. It happened to me with...
Right. They're willing to meet with you behind the scenes, but if it came out publicly, they have to deny it.
That is correct. And we had, and again, I wrote about it when I had several meetings and conversations with the former foreign minister Zarif in order to get it done. And then it was used against him because there was a picture. I was just collateral damage for that one. But I just learned, I think Zarif just got appointed as an advisor again to the new president of Iran. I still think he won't be able to meet with me because it was outed before. But again, these are relationships that it's one of those things in this, I've been doing it for 18 years. It's weird. There's always a next round. Even somebody who then loses power and you think, I'm never going to deal with him after this. And then years later, they suddenly show up again. And which is one of the reasons why even when you're successful and you strike a deal and you believe it's a good deal, you don't go and trash the other side for it. You don't say, we won, I'm strong, I gave nothing in return, because there's always going to be another round. You're always going to need them again. There will always need to, there'll be a reason for them to need you. You need to maintain those relationships. And that is not a moral stance about how I see them and what I believe about the things they're responsible for.
Right. You negotiate with your enemies. You don't negotiate with your allies. And when you have enemies, there's going to be a round and another round. I mean, what you speak to here is...
Negotiating is not legitimizing.
My wife had a question. I want to end here. She goes, as a professional negotiator, how does he use what he does with the Russians, with North Koreans, etc., at home with his wife and his kids?
I have to tell you... here's an example. I just came back yesterday. My wife and I went to visit our 10-year-old daughter in her summer camp. This is 7 weeks in. She started the summer, was supposed to be there for 3 weeks. Okay? Mm-hmm. She convinced us to go for 5 weeks. After the 3 weeks, to extend for 2 more weeks. Then we picked her up, we brought her home. Okay? It was done, right? Took her exactly 3 hours to sit with my wife and I and say, I can sit here for 3 weeks and watch TV and play with my iPad. But wouldn't you rather me riding horses, doing arts and craft and have no screen time? I would really want to go back to camp for 3 more weeks. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh my God, she just hit us where it hurts. Of course we don't want her to have screen. And she knew exactly what she was saying. 10. I can't. The answer to your wife is when it comes to my daughter and my wife, I don't negotiate. I just give up.
I'm going to pass it along to my wife, and then she's going to be like, you should pick up Mickey's advice. Well, it sounds like your daughter has picked up some of your skills. Either unfortunately, genetically or by listening to you.
Well, she's adopted, so I can't claim any genetics over this. But yeah, she unfortunately has picked up the emotional intelligence part of it. Oh boy, she gets it.
Mickey, thanks for making time.
Thank you so much for having me again.